Having broken through to worldwide audiences with Final Fantasy VII, the greatest question was, where will Final Fantasy go next? Would it play it safe, do a rerun of Final Fantasy VII and provide its new fanbase with more of the same? Of course there wouldn't. Sticking with the series' hallmark of experimentation, the next game would make a wealth of changes to not only the mechanics, but also to many visual elements. The result was one of the more contentious titles of the series. When people rank the Final Fantasy games, this one appears at the top or the bottom, very rarely in between. Some will say it's a better game than 7, others that it's the worst since 2. There certainly are plenty of comparisons to be made with Final Fantasy II, but is this one valid? Let's find out as I play through Final Fantasy VIII from the top. Final Fantasy VIII received its initial release in Japan in February of 1999 for the PlayStation. By the end of that year, it would also have been released across the rest of the world. Within 3 months, the game had already earned over $50 million in the US alone, and would be one of the fastest selling titles in the series. Much like 7, 8 would receive a release for Windows PCs. It has fewer problems than that release of 7, though there are a couple of things which we'll note when appropriate. This version would see a release on Steam in 2013, fixing compatibility but with negligible changes to the game itself. There was a plan to re-release the game onto the 8th generation of consoles as another straightforward port, but during development, the decision was made, especially with the 20th anniversary of the title, to improve some graphical aspects of the game and release this new version as Final Fantasy VIII Remastered in September of 2019. The name Remastered may be something of an exaggeration, as we'll discuss later on. There is also a major problem with the PC version of this remaster, but only on some systems. I'll talk about it a bit more later, but I'm mentioning it now because it affects most of my recorded footage. The problem lies with frame rates. Anywhere the game is meant to run at 30, it runs at 23, and when the frame rate should be 15, it instead plays at 13. So if the footage looks slow and choppy, that's why. So as you can guess, I did my playthrough of the remastered version on PC, but with a few samples of the original PS1 version. Let's crack on with the gameplay, because there is a lot to talk about here. The battle system of Final Fantasy VIII has the same core as the last few games in the series. The ATB system is still in use, and all its basic functions remain the same. There are major changes to the under-the-hood systems, but given how much that all links together, I'll quickly cover the few minor changes that are still relevant, but don't impact the gameplay as much as those major system changes. The first is equipment. From the very first game, we've had the choice of weapons, armours and accessories that are dropped from enemies or can be found in the world. This is not the case with Final Fantasy VIII. To start with, armours and accessories are completely gone. Some of their functions are replaced by Final Fantasy VIII's unique systems, but we'll get to that in good time. Weapons do remain, but with big changes to how they were previously implemented. Instead of finding new weapons, you must first find what amounts to recipes for the new weapons in the Weapons Monthly magazines that are scattered throughout the world. You must then head to a junk shop, and if you have the required items and a certain amount of money, you can create the specified weapon. The vast majority of these weapons are straightforward upgrades in attack power and accuracy. There are no elemental properties or other effects, as those are handled by the other systems. In fact, only the main character, Squall's, weapons offer anything other than those straight upgrades. His higher leveled weapons will provide access to his higher level finishing moves for his limit break. Those do return, and once again each character has their own unique limit breaks. They don't work quite like those in 7 though. Where that game had a meter that would fill with damage taken, in 8 the limit breaks work a bit more like the desperation attacks of 6. The likelihood of being able to use a limit break is linked to the hidden crisis level. This takes remaining HP and current status effects into account. Lower HP, more statuses, higher crisis level. A higher crisis level increases the chance of a limit break being available. The limit breaks don't randomly replace regular attacks though, like those desperation attacks. Instead, when a limit is available, you will see this arrow, and you can press in that direction to select the limit break. You can skip turns repeatedly if you wish to use a limit break but don't have it available. Each skip will re-roll the chance. It is a little open to abuse, given that skipping a turn is instant, letting you effectively use limit breaks every turn. But it does have that trade-off of requiring low health, or a particular magic spell to be active to use regularly. As I said, each character has their own limit breaks and weapons, and although they have their own set of base stats, like in 7, they are not at all relevant once you start to utilise the mechanics of the game. But let's take a look at the roster before we dig into those. Our lead and most used character is Squall Leonhardt. He mostly reflects the warrior class, utilising his signature gunblades in battle, all of which confer an accuracy of 255. In other words, barring status effects, his attacks will always connect. His limit break is Renzo Kuken, which deals between 4 and 8 hits depending on crisis level, each of which can be made into a critical hit if the player presses the trigger at the right time. After the main part of the limit break, Squall has a chance to perform a finisher. The finisher used is randomly selected from those that are available to the particular gunblade equipped. Quistis Trepp is the first party member to join Squall. Akin to a Beastmaster, she wields a whip and is a blue mage, though this is only relevant when it comes to her limit break. It has no effect on any other aspects of gameplay. As you may suspect, her limit break is blue magic. There are 16 spells that can be learned, though unlike previous games, they are not learned by being struck by them. Instead, they are learned by using specific items from the inventory, though most of these are dropped by defeated enemies. The power and effect of the spell is related to the crisis level. Zeldinkt is the next character, inspired by the monk class. His weapons are his fists, but you can upgrade his gloves. His limit break is Duel, which involves inputting a sequence of button presses correctly to prolong the limit. The techniques that are used during a duel must be collected by reading the Combat King magazines, which, like the Weapons Monthly, can be found out and about in the world. A higher crisis level will prolong the duel period and may change the starting move. Selphie Tilmit is a bit like a ninja, using nunchucks for attacks, though her magic abilities are also marginally stronger than most characters. Her limit break, Slot, is magic based. Despite the name, it is not a literal slot machine this time. Instead, it will simply present the player with a random spell and a number of uses. If the selected spell is not particularly useful at the present moment, you are given the option to do-over as many times as you would like. It is good, on the one hand, that you are not completely beholden to randomness, but on the other, you may be re-rolling for a while to get the spell you want. Rinoa Hartley is the closest to being co-star of the game. I mean, she is in the logo. She wields the Blaster Edge, a projectile launcher with various appearances. She is joined by her faithful dog, Angelo, who serves as one of her limit breaks. Combine allows Rinoa and Angelo to join forces and unleash a special attack. There are 2 steps to unlock each additional skill. Step 1 is to find and read a Pet Pals magazine to reveal the trick, and then Angelo must be taught the trick by assigning it in Rinoa's status screen and walking around the world. Once learned, it may be randomly used, depending on, again, the crisis level. But Combine isn't the only limit break for Rinoa. After story events, she gains access to her Angel Wings limit. If you activate this limit, Rinoa enters a Berserker state, where she will let loose with a random offensive magic each time her turn comes up, without expending any of your stock. More on that shortly. In this state, her magic will be 5 times more powerful, giving her an impressive damage potential. Irvin Kines is our final full party member. Supposedly a sharpshooter, he wields a shotgun. Didn't make sense to me either. His limit break liberally uses this shotgun, depending on the supplied ammunition. There are 8 different ammunition types that must be either bought or created. Each one has a different fire rate and effect, giving Irvin a reasonable amount of versatility. The limit breaks in Final Fantasy VIII can be impressively effective, especially if you know how to trigger the higher crisis levels. But compared to the rest of the game, it's pretty small fry on the abuse scale. The rest of the systems are heavily interwoven, and come together to be at least as abusable as the mechanics of Final Fantasy II, if not more so. At their root though, they have a lot of similarities to 6, in that summons matter. In Final Fantasy VIII, the summons are called Guardian Forces, or GFs for short, and they are linked to just about every major as yet unmentioned mechanic in the game. It gets a little complex to explain, between the terminology used and the intricacies of the system, so I'll endeavour to do my best to break it down into simple segments. Firstly, to use any aspect related to the Guardian Forces, they must be junctioned to a character. Junctioning, honestly, is a fancy way of saying equipping, and frankly everything will make a bit more sense when referred to that way, so that's what I'll try to do. So, let's equip a Guardian Force to a character. Unlike 6, you are not limited to a single Guardian Force per character. In fact, technically, you could give a single character every single one you have acquired. It would be a bad idea, but it is possible. Used properly, you can equip 3 characters with effective Guardian Forces, which is basically half your characters, which would possibly become troublesome, especially when the story will temporarily remove characters or split your party into groups. Luckily, you are able to use the Junction Exchange function, which will transplant literally everything, including Guardian Forces and magic stock, from one character to another. It means you can concentrate on 3 profiles in a way, so that really you are only switching the character model and limit break. To make every character viable simultaneously, a bunch more Guardian Forces would have been required, and then abilities would have had to be replicated, and the amount of time, to put it bluntly, dicking around in menus would have doubled. Setting up 3 profiles and attaching them to different characters is simpler, easier, and does still work within the story context of how Guardian Forces work. Anyway, by equipping a Guardian Force, that character gains access to all of its learned abilities. These are unlocked gradually through the earning of AP, which we will touch on later. There are 4 main categories of abilities, which I, at least, will call junction abilities, command abilities, support abilities, and refining abilities. Let's deal with these in order of complexity. Command abilities have been seen multiple times in the series, and they use the same concept as before. You may assign up to 3 additional command abilities, with attack being a permanent feature. There is a range of different commands available, many of which will be familiar to those who have played previous games in the series. Many of these abilities are exclusive to a single Guardian Force, so you might have to keep those in mind, but there are a few that are shared by every single GF, and they are all fairly important. Magic and item are straightforward, letting you cast magic and use items. The only thing to be aware of with these is that if you do not assign them to a command slot, you will not be able to use magic or items respectively with that character. GF is the command that will allow you to actually summon a Guardian Force in battle. This is a little different to what we've seen before too. Instead of hitting the summon button and watching the flashy effect, Guardian Forces must charge first. The charge time is theoretically related to the compatibility between the GF and the summoning character, but in reality, the difference it makes is so small that you barely notice or care, unless you are specifically doing something that makes it more important. While charging, you will notice that the character's HP has been replaced with the GF's. Any attacks during the charge time will deal damage to the Guardian Force. If its HP reaches 0, it will be knocked out, and not only will the current summoning fail, you will be unable to summon it again until you heal the Guardian Force. I hope I'm not the only one getting vibes from another long-lasting RPG series. The final shared command is by far the most important to the mechanics of the entire game. Draw allows you to draw magic out of an enemy. Every enemy will have at least one spell that can be drawn, most having 2 or 3. The magic that can be drawn depends upon the enemy and its level. Higher level, more powerful magic. Some enemies, generally bosses, may even have a new Guardian Force that can be drawn from them, so it is certainly sensible to at least try and draw from everything you encounter, even if it is just in case. But even that small facet is not why draw is so important. When you try to draw from an enemy, you will be given 2 options, cast or stock. Obviously, cast will instantly cast the drawn spell, but it has a high degree of variance. Casting drawn magic is not the main reason to use draw though. Stocking magic is the only way to have magic on command, and that is just touching the surface of what magic can do. Let's stick to the simple bits for now though. In Final Fantasy VIII, magic is not learned naturally or granted by spellbooks, nor is it unlimited. While some draw points exist in the overworld and function much the same as a singular turn against a singular enemy, the majority of magic will have to be drawn from enemies. Drawing to stock will grant you a semi-random number of that spell, depending on the strength of the spell itself and the character's magic stat. This caps at 9 per draw, but may also fail entirely, which isn't a major blow, as you can draw repeatedly from the same enemy and it will never run out of magic. You can stock 100 of a spell on a single character, though you ought to be aware that each character only has 32 slots available, and with 50 individual spells in the game, you might have to swap some things around. Even this though is not the most important use of magic. In fact, you want to avoid using your stocked magic as much as possible. But as I said, we will look into that shortly. For now, let's get back to the abilities granted by Guardian Forces. The next set to look at are supporting abilities. These obviously support the character or party in various ways. Many will be familiar to long-term players of the series. Each character can equip at minimum 2 support abilities, but the passive abilities of some Guardian Forces will allow you to choose up to 4 support abilities. As I said, many will be familiar to fans of the series, and they can affect both inside and outside of battle. The key factor with these supporting abilities is that they are always active. The next set of abilities are a little similar, in that they can always be accessed. I am talking about refining abilities. These are the other main way of acquiring magic spells. Along with a couple of other special abilities, these are accessed through the main menu under Ability. Using these abilities, you can refine magic from items, or even from other magic. Each refine ability will provide access to different magics and may use different items. The magics available to a refine ability will generally be associated with the Guardian Force that the refine ability came from. For example, Shiva will allow you to refine ice and water magic, while Ifrit will give the fire magic refine ability. Magic is not the only thing that can be refined. Rare items can also be created through the refine abilities, the singular most important of which is the card mod ability, especially if you want to abuse the game in the most efficient way. We will get there, we've still got some abilities to cover. The final type of ability to talk about are the junction abilities. These are permanently available once unlocked and are, if not the key, certainly the door through which most of the game-breaking setups are created. There are junction abilities available for all of the main stats, though you will need to mix with multiple Guardian Forces to achieve full coverage. They work by allowing you to junction or equip your stocked magic to specific attributes of your characters to increase those stats. The more of a spell you have stocked, the greater the effect. For example, each fire spell is worth 0.1 strength, so a stack of 30 will grant 3 points to strength when it is equipped to that stat. Each spell offers different boosts to different stats. To continue with fire, while it gives 0.12 strength or magic per stock, it only provides 0.04 to spirit or vitality. In contrast, Cure gives 0.15 to spirit, while only offering 0.04 to strength. Stronger spells will grant greater bonuses. Curaga, the third level of Cure, will give 0.65 points per spell to spirit, almost a 5 times increase. So as you progress through the game and access stronger magic, you will be able to boost your stats even further. But the main stats are not the only thing you can junction magic to. Those armours and accessories that no longer exist, this is where they were made redundant. Where elemental and status attributes used to be determined by these missing pieces of equipment, in this game there are junction abilities that are used to provide these effects instead. You get different junction abilities for elemental and status effects, and each of these is split into attack and defense. The attacking variants are very straightforward, working much like the attributes of weapons in previous games, by imbuing your attack with that element or status effect, with higher stocks of magic increasing effect chance or bonus damage. Defense has a touch more depth. To begin with, you can have multiple defense junction slots, allowing you to cover multiple elements and status effects at once. On the status side, a full stock of a specific status magic will grant immunity to that status. But there are also a number of spells that grant a resist chance to all status effects, though it is impossible to get complete immunity to everything in this manner. Elemental defences can not only achieve immunity to specific elements, you can even push them further to allow the character to absorb attacks of that element and regain HP when hit by them. Of course, there is a modicum of balance through this system, insofar as a magic spell can only be assigned to a single stat or attribute, so you can't just attach the strongest spell to everything simultaneously. Decisions must be made about what to junction where. The game does have an auto-select function, letting you choose attack, magic or HP as the main focus. For the most part, this is sufficient, though you may need to adjust some of the status and elemental junctions for certain fights. You can probably guess that these junction abilities are a component in breaking the game. Being able to increase stats by dozens of points would usually be tempered by the other systems of the game, and Final Fantasy VIII does try to do that, but it... Well, first let's explore how levelling works. Like the last few games, defeating enemies will grant two types of points, EXP and AP. EXP is for characters, AP for Guardian Forces, where it will unlock all those abilities we've been talking about. Experience for characters is pretty straightforward. You earn so much and the character will increase in level. Pretty standard so far. Increasing a level will increase stats, but not by much. In fact, ascending to level 100 will increase some of the main stats by as little as just 30 points. When you consider that even mid-level spells can provide similar stat boosts, levelling on its own has only a small effect. You can increase these base stats through a similar method to stat growth in Final Fantasy VI. Some Guardian Forces have different stat up support abilities that, if equipped on level up, will give that character a bonus point in that stat. Considering you only have around 90 level ups at most, and it takes time to actually access these stat up abilities, it still doesn't seem too broken. We're getting there though. One other aspect to note in regards to level is that Final Fantasy VIII uses level scaling for enemies. The higher your level, the higher the enemy levels. Higher level enemies give access to higher level magics and rarer, more powerful items. So in theory, this should give a reasonably consistent challenge, limiting the need or usefulness of grinding when you combine the low stat growth with the junction system's stat boosts. It ought to be a reasonably balanced system, as you earn the stronger magic when you are further into the game and the enemies themselves are stronger. But what if you don't increase in level? What if you could stay at a low level, yet still get access to higher level magic? Before that, let's play a game of cards. This might seem like a distraction, and this game within a game certainly is that. You can lose hours to this minigame. I am talking about Triple Triad. Played on a 3x3 grid, the aim is to end up with more cards in your colour than your opponent. Each card has 4 numbers relating to the 4 directions. These numbers determine the flipping of cards. In the most basic rules, placing a card with a higher number facing a card with a lower number on that side will cause that card to flip. There are other regional rules that add additional methods of flipping, but I won't get into them. The key takeaway is if you win, you get to take at least one of your opponent's cards. And this isn't the only way to get cards either. You can also acquire them from monsters. Rarely via drops from defeated enemies. Usually it's more intentional through the card command ability. Again, bearing similarities to a certain monster collecting series, you have a greater chance of successfully carding a monster if its current HP is lower. If you card the last enemy, the battle will end with you victorious. And here begins the breaking of the game. The enemies that you have turned into cards will still grant AP, advancing your Guardian forces and unlocking new abilities. However, they will not give any EXP. So you stay low leveled, while keeping the foes you face at a low level, while still unlocking abilities. Abilities which let you turn those cards into items, that can then be turned into magic, which itself can be turned into better magic that grants you greater stat boosts. The end result, you have effectively turned on God mode for the rest of the game. Once you have enough Guardian forces to cover the main stats, you will take next to no damage while still being capable of one-shotting most enemies. It's quite impressive how little effort it takes, which honestly ends up being one of the biggest problems with the gameplay. I went into the game pretty fresh. I had a vague idea about the importance of cards and the enemy levels scaled. My natural playstyle of being as complete as reasonably possible led to me drawing full stocks of magic I encountered, while turning every enemy I could into a card. I rapidly became overpowered, and it was fun at first, but it very quickly became boring. With no challenge, there was no need to pay attention to regular battles, and that lack of attention seeped into other aspects of the game, and threatened to eliminate my interest in the game entirely, an issue compounded by some other aspects that we'll talk about soon. Before we dig into that, I will point out that the gameplay systems, taken individually, are actually pretty great. The junction system, while initially seeming to be dauntingly complex, is powerful and effective once you reframe the terminology in your head and get to grips with it. By tying true character progression to use of mechanics, instead of typical experience grinding, you not just encourage, but necessitate the use of those mechanics. It may still lead to some grinding, at least until you start to unlock the refining abilities, as drawing a full stock will require 12 turns at a bare minimum. But this is less of an issue in the remastered version with its 3x speed mode, letting you hammer away at the draw command and fill your stock quickly. But the fact that the mechanics are so intertwined, and even linked with other aspects of the game, is also a sure highlight, making the whole experience consistent and cohesive. The only downfall is that card ability. If carding an enemy still gave experience, or was a late game ability, there may have been enough balance to maintain challenge. It might be different for you. If you intentionally avoid overpowering, or your playstyle naturally keeps you from taking it too far, you may have a different opinion. Mine though, to boil it down, is great mechanics, but poor balance. It isn't the only aspect of the game where my opinion is mixed. Let's get to world design. So, to start with, a bit of good news. My biggest problem with navigating the overworld in 7 is much less of an issue in 8. Squall has a much smaller screen footprint, which offers a lot more room to manoeuvre. To aid this, areas seem to have been designed with fewer obstacles to get caught on. It does still occur on occasion, but on the whole it feels like the designers kept smooth exploration in mind. Transitions between screens are also implemented better. It felt like movement was pretty continuous and just flowed a lot better. There was no sudden switches of direction, and it generally felt a lot more natural. Not perfect, but good enough that I'd consider it a valid trade-off to prevent any limiting of the pre-rendered scenes. Like its predecessor, Final Fantasy VIII uses a mix of 3D overworld and pre-rendered screens for basically everything else. Once again, they are great for giving locations their own uniqueness and really highlighting the character of different towns and cities. In a way, it is even expanded. Where many towns in 7, other than Midgar, only featured 1 or 2 screens, not including individual buildings, most of the towns in 8 are composed of half a dozen or more screens, often using different camera angles to show off the different designs of each location. On the other hand though, there are far fewer towns for you to explore. There are only 8 settlements, 2 of which are smaller villages, a figure that only rises to 11 if you include the gardens. It makes the world feel sparse, especially when one considers that over half of these settlements are on the first continent you explore. The Galbardian continent is where the first half of the story takes place, and features a rail system that can help you move around quicker, alongside the ability to rent cars to travel to areas off the tracks. It's pretty cool, though having to be aware of fuel is a bit of realism that is honestly unnecessary. Unfortunately, like a few prior games, particularly 3, this first area creates expectations that the rest of the world does not meet. Once you are, mild spoilers here, able to pilot Balam Garden around the world, you feel excited to have the opportunity to go and explore new areas, only to discover that there is just so little. It's made even worse by the fact that the garden controls with all the agility of a beached whale. To the north, there is only the Shumi village and Trebia Garden. You can't even access the eastern continent with the garden, and the half of it you can get to via Chocobo is a forest made aggravatingly confusing to navigate because of the camera angle. Finally, you get to the southern continent to find a barren wasteland. Now, to be fair, it is deserted for story reasons, and it's good in that respect. It's still disappointing to see this huge landmass on the map have only a single house and an optional dungeon, especially when actually getting onto the land is difficult. The garden needs to float up a beach to get onto the mainland, which would be less of an issue if the draw distance was longer than 3 feet. You end up having to guide the whale-like garden around spurs of land in a torturous dance, only to find that you need to do a U-turn, and I was getting sick of it. It made going after the few new side quests feel like even more of a chore. Once you progress through the story enough to get to the eastern continent, you're welcomed into the city of Esthar, a dazzling metropolis that does help reignite some interest. Through a bit more story, you are released to explore the rest of the continent, to find that Esthar is the only settlement. The other locations are basically for cutscenes to take place. It's the same disappointment on a smaller scale. A strong start, followed by next to nothing. Eventually, you will gain access to the Ragnarok, an airship of the now standard variety from a usage standpoint, if not an artistic one. That's not at all a complaint. The Ragnarok has a great design that really enhances that sense of speed as you move quickly around the world. It even has an autopilot, letting you select a destination and just go there. I was a little miffed at that to start with, having trundled back and forth with the garden, and finished many of the side quests by that point, but it was still welcome for the remaining hours of the game. On the subject of side quests, Final Fantasy VIII really expands on them. Where 7 had just a couple of true quest lines, 8 has half a dozen, at least, along with a few smaller quests tied to individual areas. Now, actual content-wise, most of these side quests aren't bad. The issue is the amount of back and forth. For some of them you'll travel to Balam Town to speak to one person, then travel to Delling to talk to a person, then back to Balam, then to Dollet, and it gets tiresome, and I would be lying if I said I didn't consider dropping the side quest entirely. To get back to some positivity, as I said earlier, the actual pre-rendered screens within towns are decent, and that trend follows into dungeons. While the actual enemies might fall easily, the design of dungeons is consistently strong. They all have their own visual identity. which ought to be a given at this point, but many of them also have their own little twists. One optional dungeon sets a time limit that boots you out if the clock ticks down. Another, thankfully quite compact dungeon, uses identical rooms to try and confuse the player, forcing them to find directions on stones and follow them to the goal or to the entrance. There's others, but the short version is that dungeons feel fresh, even into the late game. And if you feel like encounter rates are on the high side, there are encounter limiting abilities available, which may make late game dungeons a breeze. Though let's be fair, most encounters would be little more than speed bumps anyway, and if you just want to finish the story, it's nice to legitimately have a means to avoid encounters. And would you look at that, a segue into talking about the narrative. Yet again, there is a mix of good and bad here, and for me, while there was more good, the bad stands out a lot more. To start off, that plot convolution that was at the fringes of Final Fantasy VII does cross over the line in 8. Not only does it also lean on amnesia, it adds in time travel and consciousness transfer, sometimes all at the same time. It kicks off simply enough, introducing us to Squall and the Balam Garden, a boarding school come headquarters, where he is in training to become a seed, basically a mercenary. And yeah, some of the terminology is a bit on the nose. We proceed to get rapid introductions to the Guardian forces and the junction concept, and so far so good. It gets even better with the field exam, which is basically a genuine seed mission, and it sets things up to make it seem as if the story is going to focus on a more political conflict, with the seeds caught in the middle. That feeling grows as Squall, now a full seed and leader of a small team, is assigned to a resistance group led by Rinoa, who are trying to liberate Timber from Galbardia's control. Just when everything seems to be shaping up to be an interesting conflict of intersecting goals and obligations, things start to go off the rails. Stupid character decisions rapidly lead to the Gardens being directly involved, and shortly after, the political conflict appears to be completely forgotten, with the story descending into a typical clear good versus clear evil affair. Such stories aren't inherently bad. Many of the greatest and most enduring stories ever told were good guys versus bad guys. There was hardly any hint of grey morality with the likes of Sauron. The problem is having an interesting setup squandered and replacing it with something so basic. A process definitely not helped by the fact that most of this happens through characters simply expositing. We don't see events, we are told about them. This is one of the biggest problems. Even though the story does have its twists and turns, too many of them get explained by characters in protracted dumps of exposition that will even drop entirely new concepts on our heads with no setup and no warning. The biggest example is just painful. After setting up the initial antagonist, the sorceress Adir, who has history with the party as we discover, we go into battle, defeat her, then simply get told that she was being possessed by a sorceress from the future, despite there being no sign of internal conflict before this point. But that's just half the exposition dump. We also get told this future sorceress's exact plan in detail, destroying any mystery the game could have tried to create. Literally within 2 minutes, we go from a somewhat compelling antagonist, especially given the history between her and the party, to a futuristic name and a technobabble plan that boils down to being the end of the world, that we are now apparently fighting against. All investment is just stripped away in moments, and it sadly never gets rebuilt. The ultimate antagonist is not even met until you literally trigger the final confrontation. No time is given to what her motivation actually is, why she's doing what she's doing, or even why she is who she is. After 2 decent, complex antagonists in 6 and 7, 8 has this. this nothing of a villain. A villain that makes X-Death seem bursting with complexity. A villain that is essentially an excuse for some final boss fights. It's disappointing, and the ending continues in the same vein. We get no resolution to the geopolitical consequences, no answers about the superweapon that is still out there, or the lasting effects of its use, that supposedly destroyed the entire southern continent in the distant past. We just get a few character moments to wrap things up, which, to be fair to the game, is where it does a bit better. All the party members get their moments to shine, even if it is just one or two individual moments each. Squall and Rinoa, as the main characters of the story, obviously get far more screen time, and the way their relationship grows is probably the true heart of the narrative. Most of it is presented from Squall's point of view, and we get plenty of insight into his thoughts, which does help to establish his character. Initially, he comes off as stoic and distant and whatever. But sticking with him through the story, we are gradually shown more of his depth, as he rises to leadership of Seed, and later as he tries to figure out just what, or who, it is that he wants. We explore his doubts and his fears, and the events that shaped his distant attitude, and end up with a fairly well-rounded character. It is a slow burner of a character arc, but it does well to delve into Squall's personality without rushing too much. The other party members all have reasonably complex personalities too, and none of them feel like they are included just to boost the numbers. Each serves the story in some way, offering contrasts or complements to the other characters. It is a shame that the main plot ended up being so weak. It feels like a waste of the characters, and does risk colouring one's opinion of them through association. As far as story presentation is concerned, like 7, there is the occasional CG scene interspersed among the in-engine cutscenes. Typically used for spectacle moments, they do a great job in that respect, but are again lacking any dialogue, not even text boxes or subtitles. I do rate them above 7 CG though, because the more realistic art style does make it easier to get invested. On which note, let's check out the presentation elements. As I just mentioned, Final Fantasy VIII uses a much more realistic style, and for 1999, it's really quite good. It retroactively makes clear the strange disconnect of 7, where some fairly realistic environments were populated by bizarrely proportioned, bordering on chibi characters. 8's character designs are a vast improvement, with all the characters seeming like they actually belong in the world, at least until the remaster. The goal was clearly to provide higher quality models to the most essential things, and it does succeed in that respect, no doubt there. Characters are much more detailed, and their individual designs are made really clear to see. The trouble is the contrast between the new models and the old backgrounds. These have not received anywhere near as much attention, and it shows. On their own, they don't actually look too bad, until a high quality character is on screen. The difference in pixel density is painfully obvious, and becomes even more pronounced, distractingly so, when a new character model is in a scene with background characters that were so unimportant they didn't get a refresh. It's jarring to see a fuzzy, poorly defined person standing next to a gleaming high-detail player character. There are more issues with the remaster, which I mentioned in the opening of this video. The frame rate problem. So, while I was literally in the middle of putting together this video, a Windows update was rolled out, and well, the frame rate problem is no longer a problem. I'm reasonably certain it was the Windows update at least. Between recording extra footage on one day and the next, it was the only change to the system, and the game now runs as intended. I'm not even going to guess at the precise cause, and I don't know if it is fixed for everyone, so I'm not going to cut my comments on the issue, just be aware that they may be entirely redundant. Like 7 before it, the game is supposed to run at 3 frame rates. 60 for menus and interfaces, 30 in the field, and 15 in battle. Sometimes the remaster only manages the 60 in menus. In the field it may be 23 and battles 12 or 13. Now, this is a problem exclusive to the PC version as far as I'm aware, and it isn't even all PCs either. Bizarrely, the problem is present on my mid to high level gaming PC with its dedicated graphics card. Yet my barely better than a netbook laptop runs the game perfectly. The frame rate issue has effects that reach further than just the visuals though. There are many in-engine cutscenes that use preset music tracks. The trouble is, the music plays at its normal rate, while the actual action is ticking along at around 75% speed. This results in the music running out long before the scene finishes, reducing the impact of some moments that used musical cues, and definitely damaging the experience. The soundtrack itself is decent enough. The battle theme is a standout. You can listen to it for a prolonged time without it getting irritating. Ideal if you are intent on drawing a full stock of magic in one fight. Beyond that, I don't have much to say about it. The soundtrack serves its purpose, but there wasn't a great deal that stuck with me after finishing the game, which, to be fair, is more to do with the general quality of the series' music than any particular faults with 8's. If this was your first experience with the series, you can probably rattle off a list of tracks that you love. I've just played enough of the games by now that it takes a special track to really make its mark. Last thing to mention is the interfaces, which are very much par for the course of the series at this point. The junction interface takes a little time to get used to, but I honestly can't see any way to change them that wouldn't just do more harm than good. The best aspect is the ease of switching junction profiles between characters. I don't even want to imagine how dull and aggravating it would be to have to do it all manually. There is again some mixed feelings, though at least here it is mainly down to the actual version. As designed, the presentation aspects are solid and serve the game well. So now it's time to bring everything together. So, should you play Final Fantasy VIII? Now, I know I have been a bit harsh on the game, but that is because 6 and 7 set such a high bar between them. 8 is still a good game, it just wasn't quite up there, and its faults stand out and are easier to quantify and talk about. If you enjoy exploring game mechanics and experimenting with extreme game breaking or self-imposed challenges, Final Fantasy VIII gives you a great selection to play with, and will keep you entertained for a good while. If you are a story-focused player, it's a bit of a tougher call. The narrative elements are 80% good, the characters are strong and the plot starts off great. That remaining 20% just happens to mostly come in the later parts of the game, and it can leave a bitter taste in the mouth after you have finished the game. I'd say you should still play it because there are plenty of positives. Just be prepared for a disappointing finale. Which is roughly my final verdict. In most cases, yes, you should play Final Fantasy VIII. You just need to be prepared to accept its flaws. We again come to that version question. The original, available on disc for PS1 and also downloadable on PS3, has the most consistent visual styling, but might not look great on modern displays. The original visuals were complemented by scanlines, and without them flaws may be more obvious. The PC also has this original version, but has an extra consideration in its corner: mods. I've mentioned them a couple of times for other games, but they really shine in Final Fantasy VIII. There are music mods that replace the midified soundtrack of the PC version, not just with the original PlayStation version, but also orchestral mixes. There are also a range of HD mods to improve the visuals and interfaces for higher resolution screens. Some argue that these visual mods are even better than the remaster because they retain consistency with the rest of the game. The remaster is also available on PC, but that possible frame rate issue is honestly a killer. Hopefully it has been fixed, but I do recommend trying it first, and if you do have the slowdown, refund it and play either the modded original or the console releases of the remaster. Playing a 30-hour plus game at 75% speed is frankly torturous. The biggest benefit of the remaster, on the other hand, is that with just one button you can run the game at 3 times speed, making those admittedly few grindy spots mostly painless. Those console releases thankfully don't have the slowdown, to my knowledge at least. The visuals might be a matter of taste, but 3 times speed and the other bonus options make it worth it. Plus, with the Switch version, you get easy portability. The different options will suit different people, so just go with what works best for you, as there is no clear definitive version in my eyes. And there we have it. Final Fantasy VIII has been ticked off our list, and we have crossed the halfway point of the series. Next month, I'll be looking at Command & Conquer Red Alert. But after that, on the 6th of June, I'll be returning to the Final Fantasy series. Will the next entry be as experimental as this one? Or would it be one of those that throws back to the series' roots? If you know the game, you know the answer. The rest of us will find out when I play Final Fantasy IX from the top.